Hello, and welcome back to Using the Debugger. This lesson is going to be great. We're going to learn about exception breakpoints as we continue debugging the MyLibrary class. We'll also get to use some really cool debugger features. Recall that in the last lesson we found the expression in line 111 that's causing our null pointer exception. Let's start a new debugger session. So we'll open up our test class, open up the MyLibrary test, go run debug as JUnit test. So we'll open up our debug perspective, and since we have our breakpoint at line 111, we stop at line 111. Now remember, the problem we figured out is that we're running this getName method on a person that has a value of null, so we're getting a Java null pointer exception. Now before we fix this, let's look at another way we could have found this line of code. To do this, we'll open up the breakpoints view up in the upper right hand area, and we can see that we have our breakpoints defined and they're toggled on and off. So in addition to toggling breakpoints and defining them in the editor view, we can also define breakpoints and toggle them on and off in our breakpoints view. We can also add new breakpoints or delete breakpoints. We're going to toggle all of these breakpoints off. Now we'll add what's called a Java exception breakpoint, which we can do either by using the button in the breakpoints view or by using run add Java exception breakpoint. And when we do, we open this add Java exception breakpoint dialog box. Now the great thing about an exception breakpoint is that we don't need to know where the exception is coming from. We just tell the debugger to break wherever it finds one. When we select this, we tell it what type of exception we're looking for. So in this case, we'll type null pointer, take the selection, and then now it's added a null pointer exception, and notice that it says caught and uncaught. Now let's rerun our debug session. Here's a little trick we can use. If we right-click in the debug view, we can do terminate and relaunch at one step. Now again, it stops at line 111 even though we don't have a breakpoint set there. This is because line 111 is the last line before we encounter the null pointer exception. So we could have found it just using this one breakpoint. Now let's look at one other thing about exception breakpoints. If we go up to the breakpoint, click on it, right-click, and look at breakpoint properties, we see the properties dialog, and we can see that we're suspending on caught and uncaught exceptions. Let's uncheck the caught exception and just look for uncaught exceptions. Press OK. And then we'll terminate and relaunch. Now this time we don't stop. We just run right through the test and come up with our failure. This is because the JUnit code is catching our exception even though in our code this is an uncaught exception. So when we're using exception breakpoints with JUnit, we need to always include caught exceptions because basically all of our exceptions will be caught exceptions. Next, let's run the main method of the MyLibrary class in debug mode with this same breakpoint defined. So we'll select MyLibrary and we'll do run debug as Java application. So we're running this outside of JUnit. And as expected, we stop at line 111. So running outside of JUnit, an exception breakpoint for just uncaught exceptions works. Now let's try one more thing. Let's remove all of our breakpoints, and in fact let's actually delete them. We can delete the breakpoints by selecting this button, remove all breakpoints. It asks us are we sure, and we'll say yes. So now we have no breakpoints. Now let's terminate and rerun this debug session, what do you think is going to happen? We'll rerun it, and once again we stop at line 111 even though we have no breakpoints defined anywhere. So why did the program stop at line 111? To see the answer, let's look at Window, Preferences, Debug, and if we look at this first checkbox, it says Suspend Execution on Uncaught Exceptions. So even though we didn't have any breakpoints defined, the debugger suspended because we had an uncaught exception. Now remember, this will not find exceptions when using JUnit, since JUnit catches runtime exceptions, but it does work when we're debugging our main method as a Java application. Now let's fix our bug. So we'll cancel this. We'll go back up to the breakpoints view. We'll add back our null pointer exception breakpoint. Stop this. We'll go back to the MyLibrary test and run this in debug mode as a JUnit test. And again, we're stopped at line 111. Now, if you did the Total Beginners tutorial, you might remember this issue. In this method, we're comparing the name of the person who currently has this book checked out to the name of the person passed in as the person object in the method's argument. Now, to avoid this null pointer exception, we need to make sure that the person field for a book is not null before we run the getName method. If a book has a null person field, we know that it is not checked out to anyone, so it can't be checked out to person P1. So we can fix this problem just by adding a check for null in the if condition. Now if we wanted, we could terminate the test, change the code, and then rerun the test. But we're going to try something fancy. We're going to change the code right in the middle of the debug session just to show this feature of Eclipse. So we're going to add some code. We'll go in here and add some code inside the parentheses. We're going to say a book get person not equal null, and then we're going to put the second part inside parentheses, and we're going to be real careful about our parentheses here. Everything looks good. Now watch, when we save, our debug pointer went back up to line 109, which is the line before the statement we just changed. We'll discuss that more a little later. So now let's resume the test. So we'll come up here and press resume. Remember, we're running a JUnit test. And let's see what happens. If we open up the JUnit, we can see now that we don't have any errors. We still have one failure, but our errors went away. So we were able to change the code right in the middle of our debug session and then run from that point on to the end of the program with the changed code. How cool is that? Next, let's look at the failing test in the test checkout book method. In the failure trace, we see that it says second book should not have checked out. And we can see that it's happening at line 87. If we double click in the edit view, we go to line 87. Let's put a breakpoint there by double clicking. Now let's right click on this method in the JUnit view, and here we can say debug. So we're going to just debug this one test. So it runs and suspends at line 87 where we put our breakpoint. Now if we look at this line, it's running the checkout method, and if we step into line 87, we'll step into the checkout method. Now let's click on the second stack frame here in the test checkout book method to get our bearings. If we look here, we can see that we set up our new My Library, we added our items, and then we set the maximum books for person 1 to 1. Then we checked out one book to person 1, and now we're trying to check out a second book to person 1, and we're asserting that it should return a false. Now let's go back to our top stack frame and step through the method. If we step over line 71, we now see in the variables view that books out is set to 1. This indicates that this person has one book checked out. Let's step over again and advance to line 73, where we are comparing the books out to the get maximum books for the person. Now we can hover on books out and we can see that it equals 1, as well as looking up in the variables. Now what is the value of P1 get maximum books? Well, we can find out in a couple ways. If we expand person P1 up here, we can see that the field maximum books is 1, but technically that's not quite the same as executing the get maximum books method. To be sure, let's inspect this expression. So we'll click here, we'll hit Alt Shift up arrow twice so that we have that highlighted. Then we'll right click, and this time we'll select Display, and it pops up a window where it shows us it's an integer equal to 1. Now let's step over one more time and see what happens. We go down to the block of code in the if statement that is executed if this is successful. So here we're going to return true. So this checkout is going to succeed, which is not what we wanted. Now, I'd like to look at this again. Now we could terminate the session and start over, but we're going to have some fun instead. We're going to go back in time and do just this part again. We'll go back up in the Edit window and click on line 71. Then we're going to press this Drop to Frame button and watch what happens to our pointer. Press the Drop to Frame, we jump back up to line 71. So we go back in time to where we were up at line 71. And we can step through our statement again. This time we'll step over twice to get back to line 73. Now let's evaluate this entire expression. So we'll hold down Alt and Shift and press up arrow once, twice, 3 times. Then we'll right click again, say Display, and we can see that it's true. Now let's try this one more time. This time let's hit the up arrow one more time and get the whole expression inside the if statement. And this time we can do Control Shift D to pop up. And again, we can see that the whole Boolean inside the if statement is true, which is why it's going to the return true block of code. Now if we look at the compare operator, we can see what the problem is. We're using less than or equal, and we need just a less than operator there. But before we fix this, let's have a little bit more fun. One of the things we can do while debugging is to actually change the value of variables in the middle of the program. Let's try it. We'll change the value of books out from 1 to 2 and see what happens. If we click here on Books Out, we can right-click, select Change Value. It's currently 1. We'll type 2, press OK, and now let's step over line 73. This time it's evaluated as false, and we go to the else block. Now, of course, that's not how we actually want to fix this bug. So let's go back up, select line 71 again, do drop to frame, so we've got back up above where we're going to make the change. Now we'll just change this to a less than. We'll save, and now let's resume to finish our test. If we look at the JUnit, this time we can see that the test succeeds. At this point, we've covered everything that you need to know to start using the Eclipse debugger to debug your Java programs. If you're just trying to get started with the debugger, you can stop the tutorial at this point. In the next lesson, we'll look at some additional features of the Eclipse debugger, including more options for breakpoints and some other ways to step through our code. This is the end of Lesson 4. I'm Mark Dexter saying so long for now.